When my husband looked at me and said, "Claire, you will never survive without me," I felt something inside my heart break. Not because I believed him, but because I could not believe that the man who had held my hand for almost 30 years could look at me and think I was nothing without him. I stood there in our living room, listening to those words echo in my mind. The house was quiet, the same house where we had raised our children. The same house where we celebrated birthdays, holidays, and family dinners. The same house where I had spent years making everyone else feel loved. And now, I was standing in the middle of it, wondering when I had slowly disappeared from my own life. My name is Claire Johnson. I am a 48-year-old Black woman from the United States, and for most of my adult life, I believed that being a good wife meant giving everything you had to your family. I believed love meant patience. I believed commitment meant staying through difficult times. I believed that if you loved someone enough, they would always see your worth. But I learned something painful. Sometimes the person you spend your life supporting is the same person who forgets how strong you really are. I met my husband, David, when I was 20 years old. Back then, we were both young and full of dreams. I still remember the first time we talked. I was sitting at a small coffee shop near my workplace, wearing a simple blue dress and reading a book while waiting for my friend. David walked in, smiled, and asked if the empty chair across from me was taken. It was such a small moment. But sometimes the biggest parts of your life begin with something simple. We talked for hours that day. We talked about our dreams, our families, and the kind of future we wanted to build. David made me laugh. He made me feel seen. He told me I had the kindest heart he had ever met, and I believed every word. A few years later, we got married. We did not have a perfect life. We struggled like everyone else. There were months when money was tight. There were nights when we worried about bills. There were moments when we disagreed, but I always believed we were a team. When David lost his job, I stood beside him. When he wanted to start a new career, I encouraged him. When he felt like giving up, I reminded him of his own strength. I never thought about keeping score. That was not how I loved. I simply wanted us to succeed together. Over the years, I became a mother. Our children became the center of our world. I spent mornings preparing breakfast, afternoons helping with homework, and evenings making sure everyone had what they needed. I loved those moments. I loved hearing my children laugh in the house. I loved watching our family grow. But somewhere along the way, I started putting myself last. I stopped doing things I enjoyed. I stopped thinking about my own dreams. I became so focused on being a wife and mother that I forgot I was also a woman with hopes of her own. For many years, I did not notice how much David had changed. It happened slowly, almost too slowly to recognize. He started coming home later. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped noticing the little things I did. If I cooked his favorite dinner, he would simply eat and walk away. If I tried to talk about something that was bothering me, he would say, "Claire, you worry too much." At first, I made excuses for him. I told myself he was tired. I told myself work was stressful. I told myself every marriage had difficult seasons. Because when you love someone, you sometimes hold onto the person they used to be. You remember their kindness. You remember their promises. You remember the moments when they made you feel special, and you hope that person will come back. But one rainy morning, I realized something had changed forever. David was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at me differently, not with anger, not with sadness, just with distance. I placed his coffee in front of him and asked, "Is everything okay?" He looked down for a moment. Then he said, "Claire, we need to talk about us." Those words made my heart become heavy. Because deep inside, I already knew something was about to change, and I had no idea that before the day ended, my entire life would be turned upside down. I sat across from David at the kitchen table, waiting for him to say something that would make sense. For almost 30 years, I had known his expressions. I knew when he was worried. I knew when something was bothering him. I knew when he was hiding something. And that morning, I knew this conversation was not going to end the way I wanted. The rain outside continued falling against the windows. The sound was soft, almost peaceful, but inside my heart, everything felt heavy. David looked at me and took a deep breath. "Claire, I don't think this marriage is what I want anymore." For a few seconds, I could not speak. I just looked at him. The man sitting in front of me was the same man I had married. The same man whose hand I held on our wedding day. The same man I stood beside during his hardest moments. But somehow he felt like a stranger. I finally asked, "What are you saying?" He looked away. "I think we have changed." I swallowed the pain in my chest. "Changed how?" He stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I feel like I have spent my life taking care of everyone else. I want to live for myself now." His words confused me, because I had spent my entire life making sure he had the chance to follow his dreams. I supported him when he wanted to change jobs. I encouraged him when he doubted himself. I celebrated his successes, but somehow he believed he was the only one who had sacrificed. I looked at him and asked softly, "Did you ever feel like I was against you?" He shook his head. "No." That answer hurt even more, because if I was not against him, then why did he feel the need to leave? I wanted to ask him if all those years meant nothing. I wanted to ask him if our memories were not enough. But I stayed quiet. Sometimes, when someone has already made a decision, your pain cannot change their mind. Then David said something I would never forget. "Claire, you need to be honest with yourself. You have depended on me for everything." I looked at him. "Everything?" He nodded. "You have been at home for years. You don't know what it is like out there anymore. You don't know how to start over." Those words hurt in a way I could not explain, not because they were true, but because they showed me how little he understood me. He saw the years I spent caring for our home as weakness. He saw my sacrifices as a lack of ambition. He forgot that while he was building his career, I was building our family. I looked down at my hands. These were the same hands that cooked thousands of meals, the same hands that held my children when they were sick, the same hands that packed his lunches before work. I wondered how someone could look at those hands and only see someone who was dependent. That night, after David went asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen. The lights were dim, the house was silent. I looked around at the walls filled with family pictures. There was one picture from our 10th anniversary. David and I were smiling. We looked so happy. I touched the frame and remembered the woman I was back then. She was confident. She had dreams. She believed she could do anything. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten her. I had spent so much time being there for everyone else that I stopped asking myself what I wanted. That night, I cried, not because David wanted to leave, but because I finally realized how much of myself I had lost trying to keep someone else happy. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was coming through the window. For the first time in weeks, I felt something different, not happiness, not yet, but something small, something I had not felt in a long time. Strength. I made myself coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, and I started thinking about my life. I thought about all the things I had done. I had raised 2 amazing children. I had managed our home. I had supported my husband through difficult years. I had survived moments that many people never knew about. Maybe I did not have a career with a fancy title. Maybe I did not have a large bank account, but I had strength. I just forgot it was there. A few days later, David made his decision. He packed his things quietly. There was no big argument, no dramatic goodbye, just 2 people standing in the same house, realizing they were no longer walking in the same direction. Before he left, he looked at me. "Claire, I hope you understand. You will need to figure things out now." I looked at him calmly. For the first time, I did not feel afraid. I simply said, "I will." He seemed surprised. Maybe he expected me to beg him to stay. Maybe he expected me to fall apart. But I did not, because deep inside, something had started changing. I did not know what my future looked like. I did not know how I would rebuild my life. But I knew one thing. I was not the helpless woman David believed I was, and I was about to discover a strength inside myself that had been waiting for years. The first few weeks after David left were the hardest days of my life. I had spent almost 30 years sharing my mornings with someone. I was used to hearing his footsteps. I was used to making coffee for 2 people. I was used to having someone ask, "What's for dinner?" And suddenly, the house felt completely different. It was quiet. Too quiet. At first, I would walk into a room and expect to see him there. I would start to say something, then remember he was gone. Those small moments hurt more than I expected. But slowly, something began to happen. I started hearing my own thoughts again. For years, my life had been filled with everyone else's needs. My children needed me. My husband needed me. My family needed me. But now, for the first time in a long time, I had to ask myself a question I had avoided for years. What do I need? The answer did not come immediately. I had spent so much time taking care of others that I almost forgot what made me happy. One morning, I opened an old drawer in my bedroom. Inside, I found a notebook. It was something I had written in when I was younger. The pages were filled with dreams I had before marriage. I had written about wanting to start my own small business. I had written about wanting to learn new skills. I had written about wanting to help people in my community. I sat on my bed holding that notebook, and tears came to my eyes, not because I was sad, because I realized that the woman I used to be was still there. She was just waiting for me to find her again. I decided I would not spend the rest of my life feeling sorry for myself. I would rebuild slowly, one day at a time. I started by learning things I had always been afraid to try. I learned how to manage my own finances. I took online classes. I reconnected with old friends. I started leaving the house more. Small things that once felt impossible slowly became normal. One afternoon, I visited my daughter Jasmine. She had noticed the change in me. She sat beside me and held my hand. "Mom, I'm proud of you," she said. I smiled. "Proud of me?" "I'm just trying to figure things out." She shook her head. "No, Mom, you don't understand. You spent your whole life making everyone else stronger. Now you are finally doing it for yourself." Those words stayed with me, because sometimes we need someone else to remind us of what we cannot see. A few months passed. My life was not perfect. There were still lonely nights. There were still moments when I missed the old days, but I was no longer afraid. I began helping women in my neighborhood who were going through difficult times. I shared my story with them. I told them that losing something does not always mean your life is over. Sometimes it means you finally have the chance to begin again. During this time, I also started a small home-based business. It was something simple. I created handmade gift baskets and personal care packages for people in my community. At first, I only made a few. Then people started recommending me to others. Slowly, it grew. The same hands David believed were only meant for taking care of a home were now building something new, something that belonged to me. One afternoon, I received a phone call from David. I had not spoken to him in weeks. When I answered, his voice sounded different. "Claire?" "Yes." There was a pause. "I heard you started something new." I smiled slightly. "Yes, I did. I didn't know you could do that." His words surprised me, not because they were insulting, but because I realized he truly never knew what I was capable of. He had spent years seeing me only as his wife. He forgot I was also a person with dreams, a person with abilities, a person with strength. Before ending the call, he said, "I guess you are doing better than I expected." I looked out the window. The old version of me might have felt hurt by those words. but the woman I had become simply smiled, because I finally understood something important. My value was never decided by whether someone stayed beside me. My value was always there. I just had to believe in it again. But I had no idea that the biggest surprise of my journey was still waiting. And soon, David would discover that the woman he thought would break without him had become someone he never expected to see. Months passed, and my life slowly started becoming something I was proud of. I was no longer waking up every morning wondering why David left. I was no longer asking myself what I did wrong. Instead, I was waking up with a new feeling: peace. It was not the kind of happiness that comes from everything being perfect. It was the kind of peace that comes when you finally accept yourself. I had learned that losing someone does not always mean losing your future. Sometimes, it gives you the space to discover who you really are. My small business continued growing. What started as a simple idea in my kitchen became something bigger than I ever imagined. People in my community began sharing my work with others. They loved the care and attention I put into every order. But more than the business itself, I loved the connections I made. I met women who had their own stories. Women who had been told they were not enough. Women who had forgotten their own strength. And every time I talked to them, I realized I was not just helping them. They were helping me too. They reminded me that my story had meaning. One afternoon, I received an invitation to a community event where local business owners were being recognized. I almost did not go. The old Claire would have found a reason to stay home. She would have worried about what people thought. She would have wondered if she belonged. But the new Claire decided to attend. I wore a simple black dress. I fixed my hair. I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled. For the first time in years, I saw a woman who was not waiting for someone else's approval. I saw myself. When I arrived at the event, I noticed many familiar faces. Neighbors, friends, people who had watched my journey. Then, unexpectedly, I saw David. He was standing across the room. For a moment, everything became quiet. The man who once told me I would never survive without him was now looking at me differently. Not with doubt, not with pity, with surprise. He walked toward me slowly. "Claire," I nodded. "David." There was an awkward silence between us. So many things had happened, so many words had been left unsaid. Finally, he smiled slightly. "You look different," I smiled back. "I feel different." He looked around the room. "I heard about your business." "Yes, I didn't realize you were capable of all this." His words were not meant to be cruel, but they reminded me of how he used to see me. I looked at him calmly. "David, I was always capable. You just never noticed." He lowered his eyes. For the first time, I saw something I had not seen from him in years: regret. We talked for a while. He told me that after leaving, he thought he would feel free. He thought starting over would make him happier. But things did not turn out the way he expected. He admitted that he missed the family we built. He admitted that he had taken my love for granted. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. Those words were something I once wanted to hear so badly. Years ago, they would have made me cry. But standing there, I realized something. I did not need his apology to know my worth anymore. I had already found that inside myself. I told him, "I forgive you, David." He looked surprised. "But I need you to understand something. Forgiving you does not mean I go back to being the person I was before." He nodded slowly. "I understand." And for the first time, we had an honest conversation, not as husband and wife, but as two people who had shared a huge part of their lives. When I left that event, I felt lighter. I realized something important. Sometimes closure does not come from someone changing. Sometimes closure comes from you changing. That night, I walked through my front door and looked around my home. The same home where I once cried alone. The same home where I wondered if I would survive. But now, it felt different. Because I was different, I was no longer the woman who was afraid of being alone. I was the woman who discovered she was never alone, and I still did not know that the biggest moment of my journey was coming. Because soon, someone would be standing at my front door. And this time, it would not be someone leaving. It would be someone coming back with a completely different understanding of who I had become. The day I saw David standing at my front door was a day I never expected. It had been almost a year since he left. A year since I sat alone in the kitchen wondering how I would rebuild my life. A year since I heard him say that I would never survive without him. But now, as I stood there looking at him, I realized something. I was not the same woman who watched him walk away. I was stronger. I was calmer. And most importantly, I finally knew my own worth. It was a quiet Saturday morning. I was making coffee when I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was a neighbor. I walked toward the door without thinking much, but when I opened it, I saw David standing there. He looked different, not physically, but something in his eyes had changed. The confidence he once carried was gone. Instead, I saw someone who had spent a long time thinking about his choices. "Claire," he said softly. I looked at him. "David." There was a long silence. Finally, he said, "I know I probably don't have the right to come here." I did not answer. He continued, "But I needed to see you." I stepped aside and let him come in, not because I had forgotten what happened, not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because I was no longer carrying the same anger and pain I once carried. We sat in the living room, the same room where he once told me I could not survive alone. But now, everything felt different. David looked around. He noticed the changes I had made, the new decorations, the pictures from my business events, the awards and thank you letters from people I had helped. He smiled sadly. "You really built a life without me?" I nodded. "Yes, I did." He looked down. "I was wrong about you." Those words were quiet, but they carried a lot of meaning. I waited, not because I needed an apology, but because I wanted to understand. David took a deep breath. "I thought you needed me because you were afraid to be alone. I thought I was the reason you were strong." He paused. "But I was wrong. You were strong because of who you were, I just didn't see it." I looked at him. For years, I wanted him to understand that. I wanted him to see all the things I had done, all the sacrifices I had made, all the love I had given. But now, hearing him say those words did not feel like victory. It just felt like peace. I told him, "David, I loved you. I really did, but I had to learn how to love myself too." He nodded. "I know that now." We talked for hours. We talked about our mistakes. We talked about the years we shared. We talked about the things we should have said but never did. There were no arguments, no blaming, just honesty. At the end of the conversation, David stood near the door. Before leaving, he looked at me. "You know, when I left, I thought you would fall apart." I smiled gently. "I almost did." He looked surprised. I continued, "But falling apart is not the same as staying broken." He smiled. And in that moment, I knew everything had come full circle. The woman who once cried because she thought she lost everything had become the woman who understood she had gained herself. I closed the door after he left. Then I stood there for a moment, not sad, not angry, just grateful. Because sometimes life removes people from our path to show us the strength we never knew we had. I spent many years believing my happiness depended on someone else choosing me. But I learned something much more important. The most important person who needs to believe in you is yourself. A person can walk away from your life. A person can doubt you. A person can underestimate you. But they cannot take away the strength that lives inside you. Today, when I look back at that painful morning when David told me I would never survive alone, I no longer remember it as the day my marriage ended. I remember it as the day I found myself again. Because the truth is, I was never waiting for someone to save me. I was waiting to discover that I could save myself. And when David came back to my front door, he did not find the broken woman he expected. He found Claire, a woman who finally knew exactly who she was.